r/NoSleep, posted by Reddit user Spite Goddess. I run a museum of cursed objects. I just hired a new employee. By the way, I've had quite a few questions regarding the bonnet. I'm going to explain really quickly while I have a moment. The bonnet has been in my family for at least a couple of 100 years. All I really know is it's a light blue bonnet, although by its appearance, I'd wager it had originally been a darker color and has been sun-bleached over the years. Accompanying the bonnet is a note, which is displayed alongside in its case. It reads, "Dear Susie, something is wrong. My husband Earl, once gentle and kind, has begun to act so aggressively that I dread his company. Not only that, but random men on the street have begun to approach me even more assertively than before. Yesterday, James grabbed at my blouse in the middle of the town square. Soft James has never lifted a finger against me before. There was something not right in his eyes. My dearest sister, I have begun to fear for my life. Each day, Earl's eyes grow hungrier, his movements sharper and more abrupt. I fear that one day soon, my husband, or some other man, will give in to his darkest instincts and attack me. I know this is going to sound quite abnormal, but I think it's the bonnet. In my last letter, I told you that it was lucky, that it made all the men swoon over me. It's going too far. Each time I wear it, I notice this abhorrent behavior, and when I don't, everything seems normal. I have tried to dispose of it multiple times, but it returns to me each night in my sleep. Please, sister, dispose of it if you can. Burn it, and never wear it. If you can't, I'm sorry. Deepest love, Sarah." We know this letter was never delivered to this Susie person. It was found on the ground next to the body of Sarah Carpenter, according to my mother's. Both it and the bonnet covered in drops of blood that haven't been able to remove to this day. Poor Sarah had been quite literally ripped into far more pieces than was her natural state by several of the townspeople, all men. I'm sure you can see where this is going. We found that any man who comes within 6 feet of the bonnet begins to behave violently and aggressively, losing his logic and control. After leaving the bonnet's effective area, the man seems to return to normal, but he never goes quite back the same as he was, and if he's exposed to the bonnet a second time, the effect is even stronger. To be safe, no man is allowed to go within 6 feet of the bonnet for any reason. If there's one thing I don't need, it's the blood of some innocent girl on my hands. Anyway, like I was saying, it's been crazy around here since we opened a few years ago. Honestly, I'd plan on discussing another exhibit today. Maybe Herman, the sort of bug, or maybe Jan, the janitor, who was kind of an employee and kind of an exhibit. Turns out, though, that this morning was the morning I finally snapped and hired someone new. Here's the thing about running a museum of cursed objects. It's insanely time-consuming. Someone has to be present to turn over the hourglass with blue sand every hour on the dot. We're not 100% sure what happens if we fail to do so, but seeing as the hourglass was found untouched in the middle of a village that was burned to the ground as though it had never existed at all, the words, "Don't let it run out," scrawled next to it in the sand. We're being cautious. There's also the VHS that has to be rewound every 6 hours, the Tamagotchi that has to be killed once a day, and the UV light that has to be checked hourly to make sure it never goes out, unless we want a deadly toxin spreading throughout the entire museum and possibly the city. Keeping that up involves checking the power and the 2 backup generators 3 times a day too. The problem is, we only have 2 employees, myself and M. Of course, there's the Crow and Jan, but as both of them are somewhat cursed beings themselves and are extremely capricious, I can't afford to leave the health and safety of the museum and the city in their hands, or talons, alone. Since someone has to be in the museum 24 hours a day, Em and I barely get to sleep, let alone spend quality time together. I've had a heck of a time hiring help, though. For one thing, the Crow is extremely picky, and, since it's hard to predict what he's going to do, I don't dare bring anyone around on a permanent basis if he's shown dislike towards them. The other thing is simply that it's hard to find anyone to trust, especially someone that also meets all the employee requirements. We can't hire a man since it's not realistic for them to never go near the bonnet. We can't hire a woman in an unfulfilling opposite-sex relationship now that we have the vintage dress. Could the employees simply avoid these exhibits? Sure. But that's not acceptable. Employees have to be able to deal with any emergencies that come up, including yanking a woman away from a wedding dress or the bonnet without getting ensnared, if the need arises. Now, as you may already be aware, there's a lot of anti-discrimination laws in place. Still not as many as there probably should be, but still. I can't exactly say, I'm not hiring you because you don't seem confident enough in your opposite-sex relationship, sorry, without getting sued up the rear. In fact, I might get sued just for asking that sort of thing in the first place. That makes helpful interviews pretty much impossible. Anyway, I had resigned myself to an exhausted life with minimal time to spend with my girlfriend, until this morning. We got a call from a local museum. Not the supernatural kind, mind you, just the history kind. That in of itself was not unusual. They've gotten quite a few donations that are more up our alley, so to speak. They were in contact with my mothers before their deaths, too. We actually got our high gal with this from them. They were completely unprepared for a living species, let alone one that required feeding with several live frogs and one hare from a fertile woman every day. This sort of call is far preferable to that made by the zoo upon occasion. No matter how many times I tell them, we don't do cursed animals, other than the ancient fish, I guess. They insist that I at least take a look at their cannibalistic penguin, or their no-headed dingo, or their short-necked giraffe. That one was a weirdly patterned horse, and I believe the particular zookeeper was fired shortly afterward. The caller was an old family friend, the owner of the museum, a man I just called Jimmy. Bit of an unusual circumstance, he sniffed haughtily into the phone, which was, in Jimmy terms, a plea for help. I promised to be over at once and gave Em a lingering kiss goodbye before heading out, telling Herman hi as I passed. Herman looked quite pleased, as always. When I arrived, Jimmy looked more judgmental than normal, a sure sign of stress. He's a rather uptight man, his pudgy face set on a permanent disgruntled grimace, steel blue eyes hard and flinty. He wears a full suit and tie regardless of the day of the week and whether he's working or not, and it's always an atrocious shade of maroon. I've seen a child cry just from looking at him. Fantastic of you to take your time, he said, wringing his hands. I'd long since learned not to be offended by his brusque behavior. Hey Jimmy, what's going on? We've, received a donation, Jimmy responded. Which, duh. It's, well, come this way, please. He led me into the back of the museum, past the yellowed fossils and displays full of amber and ancient tools and weapons. Once in the back, he ushered me into what was essentially an overly large broom closet. I said, and then Jimmy broke down. One of my employees is dead, he snapped, which was the closest thing I've seen him do to crying. Dead. And no one will even believe me about what's happened. Slow down, Jimmy, I ordered. Firm is the only way to be when he's like this. You know I will believe you. Start from the beginning. It's my office, he practically sneered. The tooth. Well, that explained why we're in the broom closet. Tooth? Got it from an anonymous source, he said. Donated in the middle of the night, a couple of nights ago. He swallowed heavily, his large Adam's apple bobbing like a nervous chicken. Yeah, I've been meaning to ask why you accept mysterious midnight donations. He continued as though he couldn't hear me. Remarkable. Really. Megalodon tooth. Had it checked. Massive thing, just massive. Gorgeous. Only problem was, it was submerged in sulfuric acid. Now, I'm not a chemist, but I distinctly remember hearing that sulfuric acid was nasty stuff. Caustic enough to screw with flesh, as well as bone. Car batteries are sometimes made with it, I think. See, when I say I'm not a chemist, what I mean is, I scraped a C in high school chemistry, and that's it. The tooth was fine though? I asked. He shook his head. It's perfectly preserved. I figured the acid must be extremely dilute, although long-term exposure to even that should cause some damage. Rich, my head manager, put on nitrile gloves and used the tongs to grab the tooth. It was a big container though, and he dipped his fingers in a little bit. Should have been fine if it was diluted, but it burned right through the gloves. His sharp angled face is overcome by remorse for just a second before returning to his facade of vague disdain. Idiot's allergic to latex. Latex would have been fine. He screamed and dropped the tooth on the counter, and it... Jimmy? I prompted after a long moment, during which the man audibly grated his teeth together. I can't really explain it, he said haltingly. He straightened. The second the tooth was out of the acid fully, there was this roar. It vibrated, like it was underwater. And the next thing we knew, Rich, he was... Jimmy took a deep breath. We ran out and locked the door to the office behind us. It's still in there. I know it. Sometimes you can hear growls and roars and sounds like whooshing sounds, you know? Like waves. Who's we? I asked. He stared at me, blinking. What? You said we ran out, not I. Who else is here? Who else saw this? Oh, he said. Assistant manager, Courtney. She's actually the one who grabbed me and pulled me out of the room. Locked it too. She's quick on her feet, that one. She's been waiting outside the office for me. I'd like to speak with Courtney, I said, wondering if she would be marginally more helpful. Of course, he said, but didn't move towards the door handle. Right, I said, and opened the door myself. I walked right towards the office briskly, nodding automatically to a few museum patrons walking by, forgetting momentarily that this wasn't my museum, and I didn't have to be in customer service mode. Just as Jimmy had said, there was a girl waiting outside the office door. She was blonde, pixie cut. She was short and had a dainty sort of look to her. Her posture said fear and anxiety. She met my eyes, and hers were ice blue, and they said something else, something deeper. Courtney? I said. She looked me up and down and smiled. The way it stretched at her cheeks looked almost uncomfortable. You must be Alex, right? She responded. When she spoke, her voice was soft. I could almost miss it. Yet I heard every word perfectly clear. Thanks for coming. Mr. Smith isn't much help in a crisis. Don't I know it? Is there still activity in there? It was a stupid question which I realized exactly 2.5 seconds later, when a low-pitched, wavering growl ripped through the room. It was clearly coming from the office. Courtney raised an eyebrow. Jimmy said all this happened when the tooth left the acid. Is that right? I asked. Yep, she said, popping the pea. Richard's dead for sure. We got out while it was still, preoccupied with him. What do we do? I grimaced. Well, for starters, we call me if we get something as weird as a giant prehistoric shark tooth that doesn't seem at all affected by strong acid. Courtney opened her mouth, eyes flashing, but I cut her off. More importantly for the situation, We try to get that tooth back in the acid to see if it stops. The ground vibrated as whatever curse has hold of that tooth roars again. It was louder then, and out of the corner of my eye, I spotted a few museum guests giving us curious looks. "You didn't think to evacuate the facility?" I hissed. "You think Mr. Smith would give up a day of income for something that's locked in his office?" "Fair. So, if putting that tooth back in the acid doesn't help, then what?" I frowned. I'm hopeful that it will. Clearly, taking it out was the catalyst, and often, things just don't care to be disturbed. Possibly, the acid was even present to contain whatever power is now free. It's hard to know the rules with these things unless you bring in a sensitive, and mine's busy watching the museum. If it doesn't work, well, I hope you're a fast runner. Surprisingly, Courtney didn't seem fazed by this. "Oh, I am." "It's probably going to attack you first," I told her. "In my experience, curses go after original offenders preferably. If it doesn't recognize you from before, though, it'll probably go after me. I'm more experienced in this stuff than you. It'll probably see me as more dangerous. So if it comes after you, run," I said. I placed my hand on the door. Resulting rumble was instantaneous. "Ready?" "Are you?" She smirked. I opened the door. I sprinted in, vaguely aware of Courtney beside me. I choked on the miasma as it hit me, strong and thick, smelling like salt and that vague wetness of the sea. When I stumbled, Courtney pulled me up by my arm almost effortlessly, which surprised me, because I had at least a foot on her. I finally managed to open my eyes. I caught sight of the huge jar, full of liquid. Beside it, a massive, slightly yellow tooth. Chin! Courtney's yell alerted me in time. I glanced up and saw the air rippling as though I was seeing a mirage. I leapt to the side just in time for whatever it was to race past me with an angry wail. I felt the air brush past my face as it passed me and almost choked again. Instinctively, I knew this thing was dangerous, and the mangled body of Rich on the floor only emphasized that. I'd almost rolled right into him. "Go, Courtney," I snapped, dodging the thing as it came at me. I was a little too late, and something sharp and searing caught my left arm, opening up a gash before my eyes that began spilling blood in time with the beat of my heart. Almost instantly, I was dizzy. Crap. I landed heavily on the floor and stared up at the place where the very air rippled. Somewhere inside me, through the haze of fear and pain, I knew I was about to die. And in that moment I saw it. It was a megalodon. I mean, I'd never seen one, but I was sure of it. Huge, bigger than any creature I'd ever seen. It was shark-shaped but not quite right, bulging in the wrong places, slender in the wrong places. Its eyes, unlike most sharks, were not glassy. No, they had something sharp within them, a very human intelligence, and more than that, a very human hatred. I closed my eyes tight and waited for death. Death, however, never came. What did come was a soft plop as Courtney dropped the tooth into the jar of acid. At once, the oppressive feeling, the phantom seawater, all vanished. I took my first deep breath since stepping foot in the room. "Dumbass," snapped Courtney. Fuzzily, I heard a ripping sound, and then cried out in protest as someone applied pressure to my injury. "Stop moving," I registered her saying. "Alex, stop squirming, I'm trying to help you, you idiot." I opened my eyes. The megalodon was gone, and Courtney was calmly fastening a piece of cloth around my injured arm. Who are you?" I slurred. "Courtney," said Courtney. "No, I mean..." I sighed, closed my eyes again. I could feel my alertness returning to me, although fatigue was starting to set in now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "No, I mean, You seem pretty good in crisis. An understatement. Why the hell are you working for Jimmy? He thinks running out of his favorite wine constitutes a crisis. Courtney paused in her ministrations for a moment, then continued, the burning and stinging returning. I gritted my teeth. I need the money, she said thoughtfully. I've tried a ton of odd jobs before this one. Never stayed at one too long, since they all sucked. This one's okay, I guess. I actually went to school for archaeology, but the field was less exciting than I thought it would be, so I suppose I'm trying to figure out what to do. She finished fastening the cloth, which I belatedly recognized to be her own fleece jacket. That'll do until you can get to an actual hospital, she said, apparently pleased with her work. I wanted to ask how she knew how to do that. How she could be so completely unfazed in front of a ghost megalodon. I looked around the room, vision still swimming. There was a huge jar, the tooth sitting innocently at the bottom, looking for all the world as though it had never left. I noticed that Courtney had even remembered to screw the lid back on. Next to us was Rich, who was full of lacerations and quite dead. Courtney didn't spare him a second glance. Do you want to work for me? I asked, and then passed out. Em was furious with me, obviously, mostly for hiring someone she doesn't know without even having an interview or any background information, but also for getting so hurt and passing out. She clutched me tight to her chest for nearly half an hour and yelled obscenities into my ear, berating me for my clumsiness and stupidity while I stroked her fluffy hair and nodded obediently. Just like always, she smelled like apple and cinnamon and something smoky and very Em. You don't even know who Courtney is, Em complained. She might have kept her head in crisis, but what if she's a criminal? What if she doesn't actually believe in curses, and that's why she was so chill? What if she hates her husband? What if... Babe, I said, exasperated. I was still a little woozy from blood loss, but overall was feeling much better after my short stay in the hospital. Lucky for me, the local doctors and nurses know better than to ask how I got myself such an injury, so there was very little paperwork. Look, I'm sorry for hiring someone without asking you. I promise I'll keep a very close eye on her, okay? But babe, I'm exhausted. You're exhausted. And if Courtney hadn't been there today, I would be dead. Don't you think we could use some help? Em grumbled into my hair incoherently. Clearly, not mollified. Plus, I added, sneaking in a kiss to her collarbones that made her stiffen, wouldn't you like some more time to ourselves? I guess, she muttered. And that was that, because Em can never say no to me, and because she'd been up for 26 hours already, and was scheduled for the night shift again, considering my thoroughly bandaged injury. So anyway, Courtney's first day is Thursday, and I'm excited for her to start. Obviously, it's a little dangerous hiring someone in this business, especially someone I know little to nothing about. But honestly, I was going to go loony soon if I didn't get a break. Plus, it's just not safe to have extremely dangerous, cursed objects around a bunch of sleep-deprived people who could slip up and do something stupid at any time. Just imagine if I knocked over the cabinet of horrors. It could happen, with how clumsy I get when I'm tired. And anemic, now apparently. The megalodon tooth is sitting innocently in its jar of sulfuric acid, in a brand new display with a sign that vehemently warns visitors against attempting to touch it. I've also taped around the lid, so that it'll be harder to remove, and will at least take enough time so that if someone tries to do so, one of the museum staff will have time to notice it and stop it. Em confirmed just by touching the jar that the tooth wasn't going to be an issue while it was submerged in the acid. Although she warned about the megalodon curse was full rage and not to be trifled with. It's late, and I've got to go murder that Tamagotchi and things, so I've got to get off for now. I'll try to update you on how Courtney is doing as soon as I can. From all of us at the Hall of the Cursed, thanks for reading.